Welcome to another journey through history's forgotten corners, where we explore the stories that textbooks prefer to whisper about. Tonight, we're venturing into a place where sanity was measured in chains, where cure meant confinement, and where the line between patient and prisoner was drawn in invisible ink. Before we begin this exploration into the shadowy world of Victorian asylums, why don't you dim those lights? Perhaps turn on a gentle fan for that soothing background hum, and settle in for a story that will make you grateful for the simple freedom of choosing when to open a door. Picture this: it's 1885, and you've just been diagnosed with what Victorian doctors might call melancholia, hysteria, or perhaps the wonderfully vague moral insanity. Your crime. Maybe you questioned your husband's authority once, too often. Or perhaps you were caught reading books deemed inappropriate for your gender. Or you simply had the misfortune of experiencing what we now understand as depression during an era that viewed mental distress as a moral failing. Regardless of the reason, you're about to discover what it truly meant to be forgotten by society, hidden away in one of Britain's sprawling Victorian asylums. The irony is almost poetic. Institutions built in the name of compassion became monuments to human suffering. Places designed to heal minds that systematically broke spirits instead. Tonight, we'll walk through those imposing iron gates together, past the manicured gardens that masked the screams within, and into a world where your identity would be stripped away faster than your street clothes. Your journey into madness, as they called it, begins not with the snap of shackles, but with something far more insidious: the slow, methodical erasure of everything that made you human. The ritual of admission, where identity goes to die. The massive stone facade of Bethlehem Royal Hospital, or Bedlam as it was infamously known, loomed before you like a Victorian cathedral dedicated to suffering rather than salvation. The year could be 1850, 1870, or 1890. It hardly mattered. The ritual remained hauntingly consistent across decades and institutions throughout Britain. You've been brought here by family members who can no longer cope, or perhaps by authorities who've decided your behavior threatens the delicate fabric of proper society. As you approach those forbidding entrance doors, flanked by attendants whose expressions suggest they've witnessed this scene countless times before, you might notice the beautiful irony of the architectural details. Gothic spires reach toward heaven, while the building's purpose drags souls toward what many considered a living hell. The Victorian obsession with appearances demanded that even their repositories for society's unwanted maintain an air of respectability. The admission process began with what asylum administrators proudly called reception, though you'd quickly discover this bore no resemblance to any welcome you'd previously experienced. A stern-faced clerk, usually male, regardless of the patient's gender, would record your particulars in a massive, leather-bound ledger. Your name, age, occupation, and the circumstances of your commitment would be scratched into the permanent record with all the emotion of cataloguing inventory. But here's where the psychological torture truly began. Disguised as medical necessity, every personal possession that connected you to your former life would be systematically removed and catalogued. Your clothing, jewelry, letters from loved ones, photographs, books, even religious items, all would disappear into storage boxes that might as well have been marked former human being. The message was clear: the person you were before crossing this threshold had ceased to exist. The physical examination that followed was conducted with a clinical detachment that stripped away dignity along with garments. Male attendants routinely examined female patients, justified by the Victorian belief that modesty was a luxury the mentally ill could not afford. Your body would be scrutinized for signs of what they termed degeneracy, marks or characteristics that Victorian pseudoscience claimed could predict moral weakness or mental instability. A prominent forehead might indicate criminal tendencies, while certain facial features were thought to reveal sexual deviance. Following this humiliation came the uniform, rough, shapeless garments in institutional grey or brown, designed more for easy identification of patients than comfort or dignity. These clothes served as a daily reminder that you were no longer an individual but a specimen, a case study, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be helped. The most psychologically devastating aspect of admission wasn't the loss of possessions or the clinical examinations. It was the reclassification of your identity. You were no longer Mary, the schoolteacher, or John the clerk, or Elizabeth, the mother of three. You became patient 247, or the melancholic in Ward 6, or simply the woman who believes she can write poetry. Your rich, complex human identity was reduced to a diagnosis scrawled in a medical file, a shorthand description that would follow you through every interaction within these walls. The dormitory assignment came next, and this is where the true genius of Victorian institutional cruelty revealed itself. You weren't simply assigned a bed. You were strategically placed to maximize institutional efficiency while minimizing human comfort. New arrivals were typically housed with long-term patients, ostensibly for guidance, but actually to accelerate the psychological process of accepting institutional life as your new reality. Your sleeping space consisted of a narrow iron bed with a thin mattress that had absorbed decades of fear, desperation, and bodily fluids from previous occupants. Privacy was a concept that existed only in your increasingly fragmented memories. Everything you did, from sleeping to eating to using the primitive sanitation facilities, occurred under the watchful eyes of attendants, other patients, or both. The window placement in these dormitories revealed another layer of institutional psychology. Set high in the walls, they provided just enough light to maintain circadian rhythms, but were positioned too high for patients to see outside. This wasn't accidental. It was designed to prevent you from maintaining visual connection with the world you'd lost, while simultaneously denying you the psychological comfort of natural views that might remind you of your former life. The daily schedule, precision-engineered dehumanization. If you harbored any illusions that asylum life might allow for personal agency or spontaneous human behavior, the daily schedule would quickly disabuse you of such fanciful notions. Victorian asylums operated with military precision, not to promote healing, but to maintain order among hundreds of individuals who had been systematically stripped of their humanity. Your day began before dawn, typically at 5 a.m., with the harsh clanging of bells that seemed designed to jar you from any peaceful sleep. You might have managed despite the chorus of moans, cries, and mechanical sounds that formed the asylum's nighttime symphony. There was no gentle awakening, no moment to orient yourself, just the immediate demand that you rise and begin another day of institutional existence. The first task was what attendants euphemistically called morning ablutions, though these bore little resemblance to the private grooming rituals of your former life. In large, echoing washrooms with stone floors and minimal heating, dozens of patients would be herded together to perform their morning necessities under the watchful eye of attendants who viewed privacy as an obstacle to efficient supervision. The washing facilities consisted of cold water basins, harsh soap that left skin raw and cracked, and communal towels that spread disease as efficiently as they dried bodies. For female patients, the particular cruelty of supervised bathing was compounded by the presence of male attendants who claimed medical authority over every aspect of your physical being. The message was clear. Your body was no longer your own. It belonged to the institution. Breakfast, followed immediately. And this is where you'd encounter one of the asylum's most insidious control mechanisms: the systematic use of nutrition as a behavioral modification tool. The dining hall, a cavernous space with long wooden tables and benches, would echo with the sounds of hundreds of metal spoons against tin bowls, creating a rhythmic percussion that would become the soundtrack to your degradation. The food itself was deliberately monotonous: thin porridge, stale bread, weak tea, and occasionally a piece of meat so tough it seemed designed to break teeth rather than provide nutrition. But the real cruelty wasn't in the quality, it was in the presentation. Meals were portioned not according to individual need or preference, but according to your place in the asylum's elaborate hierarchy of worthiness. Good patients, those who caused no trouble and followed every rule without question, might receive slightly larger portions or occasionally a piece of fruit. Difficult patients would find their meals reduced to subsistence levels, a daily reminder that survival itself depended on complete submission to institutional authority. This wasn't medical treatment, it was behavioral conditioning disguised as healthcare. The seating arrangements during meals revealed yet another layer of psychological control. You weren't allowed to choose where to sit or with whom to share conversation. Instead, attendants assigned places according to diagnostic categories and behavioral assessments. The melancholics sat together, the hysterics were grouped at another table, while those diagnosed with moral insanity were often isolated entirely. This segregation served multiple purposes beyond simple organization. It prevented patients from forming meaningful relationships that might provide emotional support, while simultaneously reinforcing the medical labels that had replaced their human identities. When you're constantly surrounded by people who share your supposed condition, it becomes increasingly difficult to remember that you were once simply a person experiencing distress rather than a walking diagnosis. Following breakfast came what the administration proudly termed therapeutic work. Though this was perhaps the most cynical misuse of language in an institution already rich with euphemisms. The work therapy consisted primarily of unpaid labor that maintained the asylum's operations while generating profit for the institution. Male patients might find themselves working in the asylum's gardens, workshops, or laundry facilities, performing tasks that required physical strength but little skill or creativity. The work was deliberately repetitive and mind-numbing. Hours spent washing clothes in caustic solutions that left hands raw and bleeding, or endless days digging and replanting the same garden beds under the supervision of attendants who viewed productivity as more important than the workers' well-being. Female patients faced their own particular brand of therapeutic exploitation. Needlework was considered especially suitable for women, not because it provided genuine skill development, but because it required the kind of docile, focused attention that asylum administrators believed would cure female hysteria. Hours upon hours would be spent bent over embroidery hoops or sewing machines, creating linens and clothing for the institution while receiving no compensation and little recognition for their labor. The cruel genius of this system was that it was presented as treatment rather than exploitation. Patients who refused to participate in work therapy were diagnosed with additional mental deficiencies and subjected to more restrictive treatments. Those who worked diligently were praised not for their skill or effort, but for their compliance with institutional expectations. Before we continue deeper into this harrowing exploration, I'd love to know where you're joining us from tonight. What time is it where you are? Are you settling in for sleep, or perhaps listening during a quiet moment in your day? If these stories of forgotten history truly resonate with you, I'd be grateful for a like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find value in these journeys into the past. I'd also love to hear in the comments what historical topic you'd like us to explore next, or simply check in and let us know you're part of this growing community. Your engagement means the world to me, and I want you to know how much I appreciate you being part of our little corner of the internet. Thank you for your continued support as we uncover these hidden chapters of human experience together. The theatre of treatment. When medicine becomes torment. The afternoon hours in Victorian asylums were reserved for what administrators and visiting dignitaries were shown as evidence of progressive medical treatment. But behind the carefully orchestrated demonstrations lay a reality, far more sinister than the most creative horror novelist could imagine. Medical rounds occurred with clockwork precision, usually beginning around 2 p.m., when the asylum's physician would make his theatrical entrance into each ward. Dressed in formal attire that emphasized his authority over the assembled patients, he would move through the spaces with an entourage of attendants and note-takers, conducting what he genuinely believed to be scientific inquiry into the nature of mental distress. The examination process was a masterpiece of pseudo-scientific theater. Patients would be lined up like specimens in a natural history museum, while the physician applied the latest theories of Victorian mental medicine. He might measure skull circumference with brass calipers, believing that cranial dimensions revealed psychological characteristics. Facial features would be scrutinized for signs of what phrenologists claimed were indicators of mental deficiency or moral corruption. But the most disturbing aspect of these medical evaluations was their complete disconnection from anything resembling genuine therapeutic intent. The physician wasn't trying to understand your individual experience of distress or trauma. He was attempting to categorize you according to prevailing theories that viewed mental illness as evidence of genetic inferiority, moral weakness, or evolutionary regression. Your responses to his questions would be recorded not as expressions of human suffering worthy of compassion, but as symptoms to be catalogued and compared to textbook descriptions of various mental conditions. If you expressed sadness about your confinement, this became evidence of your melancholic disposition. If you protested the conditions of your treatment, this proved your excitable nature and justified more restrictive interventions. The treatments themselves represented Victorian medicine at its most confidently ignorant. Hydrotherapy, one of the era's most popular psychiatric interventions, involves subjecting patients to extremes of hot and cold water application. You might find yourself strapped into a chair, while streams of ice water were directed at your head for hours at a time, or wrapped in sheets soaked with scalding water until your skin was raw and blistered. The rationale behind these treatments was based on the theory that mental distress resulted from improper circulation of bodily fluids, and that shocking the system with temperature extremes would restore proper balance. The reality was that hydrotherapy sessions often left patients in states of physical collapse, which was then interpreted as evidence that the treatment was successfully calming their disturbed minds. Mechanical restraints were presented as another form of medical intervention, though their application revealed the asylum's true priorities. The tranquilizing chair, invented by Benjamin Rush and enthusiastically adopted by Victorian alienists, was designed to completely immobilize patients while restricting blood flow to create a state of physical weakness that was mistaken for mental calm. You might find yourself strapped into this device for hours or even days, unable to move your arms, legs, or head, while circulation to your extremities was deliberately restricted. The psychological impact of complete helplessness, combined with the physical discomfort of prolonged immobilization, created a state of learned helplessness that asylum staff interpreted as successful treatment of your mental condition. The rotating chair represented perhaps the pinnacle of Victorian psychiatric innovation. This device would spin patients at high speeds until they became violently ill, based on the theory that mental distress resulted from improperly aligned brain matter that could be corrected through centrifugal force. The experience of being spun until you lost consciousness, then revived only to be spun again, created a level of physical and psychological trauma that often left patients permanently damaged. But mechanical torments were only part of the therapeutic repertoire. Chemical treatments included regular doses of mercury, lead-based compounds, and other substances that we now know to be highly toxic. The side effects of these medications, including neurological damage, organ failure, and severe psychological disturbances, were interpreted as evidence that the treatments were working to drive out the mental illness, rather than recognized as symptoms of poisoning. The isolation cells, or padded rooms as they were sometimes called, represented the asylum's final solution for patients who refused to submit to institutional authority. These were small, windowless chambers lined with canvas or straw matting where patients might be confined for weeks or months at a time. The isolation wasn't simply physical. It was designed to create complete sensory deprivation that would break down psychological resistance to institutional control. In these cells, you would lose all contact with natural light, human conversation, and the basic environmental cues that help maintain mental orientation. The padding wasn't installed for your safety. It was there to muffle your cries and prevent damage to the institution's property. When you inevitably began throwing yourself against the walls in desperation, the feeding of isolated patients revealed another layer of institutional cruelty. Meals were pushed through slots in the door, often consisting of nothing more than bread and water, served at irregular intervals to prevent you from maintaining any sense of time or routine. This wasn't punishment, according to asylum records. It was medical treatment designed to calm your disturbed mind through systematic sensory restriction. Evening descent, when darkness falls on broken minds. As evening approached in the Victorian Asylum, the carefully maintained facade of medical respectability would begin to crumble, revealing the true nature of these institutions as repositories for society's discarded souls. The dinner hour, beginning around 6 p.m., marked the beginning of what many patients privately called the dark hours, when reduced staffing and administrative oversight allowed the asylum's underlying brutality to emerge more clearly. The evening meal followed the same dehumanizing protocols as breakfast, but with an added layer of psychological torment. By this point in the day, the combination of inadequate nutrition, physical exhaustion from forced labor, and the cumulative stress of constant surveillance had left most patients in states of barely controlled desperation. The dining hall filled with an undercurrent of tension that attendants managed through intimidation rather than compassion. Patients who had shown any signs of resistance during the day would find their evening portions reduced or eliminated entirely. This wasn't documented as punishment, of course, but rather as modified dietary therapy, designed to address their particular manifestation of mental distress. The message was unmistakable. Survival depended not on recovery or improvement, but on absolute submission to institutional authority. After the evening meal came what administrators euphemistically called recreational time. Though this bore no resemblance to any leisure activity you might have enjoyed in your former life, in poorly lit common rooms filled with the mingled odors of unwashed bodies, disinfectant, and human waste, patients were expected to remain quiet and compliant, while attendants supervised from positions that emphasized their authority over the assembled group. For female patients, recreation might consist of supervised needlework by dim gaslight, creating the same institutional linens they had worked on during the day's therapeutic labor. Male patients might be allowed to sit in silence, perhaps reading from a carefully selected collection of religious texts that emphasized submission to authority and acceptance of suffering as divine will. The cruel irony of these evening hours was that they represented the time when normal human beings would typically engage in the social interactions, creative pursuits, and personal reflections that maintain psychological health. In the asylum, these fundamental human needs were systematically frustrated, replaced with activities designed to reinforce patient status and discourage the kind of independent thinking that might lead to questions about institutional practices. As night approached, the process of preparing for sleep revealed perhaps the most intimate cruelties of asylum life. Personal hygiene, that basic human dignity, became another opportunity for institutional control. Patients were herded into communal washrooms where privacy was not just absent but actively discouraged as a sign of mental disturbance. The bedtime medications represented Victorian psychiatry's most direct assault on consciousness itself. Laudanum, chloral hydrate, and other powerful sedatives were administered not according to individual medical need, but as part of a systematic effort to maintain institutional order. The doses were calibrated not to promote healing sleep, but to ensure that patients remained docile and manageable through the night hours when staffing was reduced. The psychological impact of enforced medication was as devastating as its physical effects. When your consciousness itself becomes subject to institutional control, when even your dreams are chemically managed by others, the last vestiges of personal autonomy disappear. You began to exist in a twilight state between waking and sleeping, never fully alert but never truly at rest, always suspended in a chemically mediated limbo that served the institution's needs while destroying your capacity for genuine recovery. The dormitory atmosphere during the night hours revealed the true human cost of Victorian asylum care. In rooms filled with dozens of beds, you would hear the sounds of people whose minds had been systematically broken by the very institution that claimed to heal them. The weeping, the anguished cries, the repetitive behaviors that emerged when pharmaceutical control began to wear off, all created a nighttime symphony of human suffering that attendants learned to ignore as background noise. The night staff, reduced in number and often the least qualified employees in the institutional hierarchy, maintained order through a combination of chemical sedation and physical intimidation. Patients who disturbed the institutional peace through crying, calling out, or attempting to leave their beds would be subjected to immediate and severe consequences. Restraints would be applied, additional sedatives administered, or in extreme cases, patients would be removed to isolation cells, where their disturbances wouldn't affect others. The morning would bring a repetition of the same dehumanizing cycle, each day eroding a little more of whatever psychological resilience had allowed you to survive the previous one. The most tragic aspect of long-term asylum residency wasn't the physical deprivations or even the medical torments. It was the gradual recognition that the person you had been before entering these walls was slowly being erased, replaced by an institutional identity that existed solely to serve the convenience of your captors. Recovery, in any meaningful sense, became not just unlikely but actively discouraged. Patients who showed signs of genuine psychological improvement represented threats to institutional stability. They might ask uncomfortable questions about treatment methods, or worse, they might recover sufficiently to challenge their continued confinement. The system was designed not to heal minds, but to manage bodies, not to restore dignity, but to maintain order. The Victorian Asylum represented society's solution to the inconvenient reality of human psychological suffering. rather than developing genuine understanding or effective treatments. It created elaborate institutions designed to hide the problem from public view, while generating profits for administrators and providing employment for attendants, who were often barely more qualified than the patients they supervised. As you lay on your narrow institutional bed, listening to the sounds of dozens of other broken souls around you, you might begin to understand that your greatest crime hadn't been the behavior that led to your commitment, but the simple misfortune of experiencing mental distress in an era that viewed such suffering as evidence of moral failure, rather than recognizing it as a fundamental aspect of human experience that deserved compassion rather than punishment. This was your life now. This was what it meant to be forgotten by the world, hidden away in one of Victorian society's most shameful secrets. A living ghost in an institution that traded in human suffering while proudly displaying certificates of medical progress and social reform. The rise and fall of John Conolly, the reformer, who reformed nothing. In the annals of Victorian psychiatric history, few figures loom as large or as tragically ironic as John Conolly, the man who promised to revolutionize asylum care and instead became the architect of a more sophisticated form of institutional cruelty. His story reveals the dark heart of Victorian reform movements, the ability to create systems of oppression, while genuinely believing oneself to be a liberator. Born in 1794 to a middle-class family in Market Russon, Lincolnshire, Conolly entered the world during an era when the treatment of the mentally ill was undergoing what historians would later call the Great Confinement. His early life gave no indication that he would become synonymous with psychiatric reform, or that his name would be whispered with equal measures of hope and horror in asylum corridors across Britain. Conolly's path to psychiatric prominence began with failure in more conventional medical practice. After graduating from Edinburgh University in 1821, he struggled to establish a successful private practice, his personality proving too intense and his methods too unconventional for the refined sensibilities of middle-class patients who preferred their physicians to be reassuring rather than revolutionary. The turning point came in 1839, when Conolly was appointed as the resident physician at Hanwell Asylum in Middlesex. The institution he inherited was a microcosm of everything wrong with Victorian psychiatric care. Patients chained to walls, mechanical restraints used as routine management tools, and a staff more concerned with maintaining order than providing any semblance of treatment. But where others saw an efficiently managed warehouse for society's unwanted, Conolly saw an opportunity to implement his radical vision of moral treatment. The transformation began with what appeared to be a humanitarian revolution. Conolly's first act was to remove all mechanical restraints from Hanwell's 800 patients, an unprecedented decision that sent shockwaves through the psychiatric establishment. Chains, straitjackets, restraining chairs, and the various mechanical devices that had defined asylum management for decades were relegated to storage rooms, replaced by what Conolly proudly called the influence of kindness and human understanding. The initial results seemed to validate Conolly's approach. Visitors to Hanwell were amazed to find patients moving freely through corridors and common areas, engaging in conversations with staff, and participating in activities that bore some resemblance to normal human interaction. Medical journals published glowing reports of the Hanwell experiment, and Conolly became the darling of progressive reformers, who saw in his work proof that enlightened management could cure society's most intractable problems. But the reality behind Conolly's public triumph revealed the seductive danger of reform movements that change methods while preserving underlying structures of oppression. The removal of physical restraints hadn't eliminated coercion. It had simply made it more sophisticated and therefore more insidious. Conolly's system of moral treatment replaced mechanical chains with psychological ones. Patients were subjected to constant surveillance under the guise of therapeutic observation. Their every word, gesture, and expression was recorded and analyzed as symptoms of their mental condition. The freedom to move through asylum corridors came at the cost of surrendering any claim to privacy, dignity, or autonomous thought. The classification system Conolly implemented at Hanwell represented perhaps his most lasting and damaging innovation. Patients were sorted into elaborate hierarchies based not on medical need, but on their willingness to conform to institutional expectations. The moral patients, those who accepted their diagnosis and demonstrated appropriate gratitude for their treatment, were rewarded with better food, more comfortable accommodations, and small privileges that made institutional life marginally more bearable. The refractory patients, those who questioned their confinement or challenged asylum authority, found themselves subjected to increasingly sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation, designed to break their resistance without leaving the physical evidence that had made old-fashioned restraints politically problematic. Conolly's genius lay in his ability to present this system as scientific progress. He published detailed case studies that seemed to demonstrate the effectiveness of moral treatment, carefully selecting examples that supported his theoretical framework while ignoring the countless patients who deteriorated under his care. His writings, filled with the language of enlightenment, philosophy, and medical authority, convinced readers that Hanwell represented the triumph of reason over superstition, science over brutality. The transformation of Sarah Mitchell, one of Conolly's most celebrated case studies, illustrates both the seductive appeal of his methods and their underlying horror. Mitchell, a 34-year-old seamstress committed to Hanwell in 1841 for what her family described as periodic melancholy and inappropriate behavior, arrived at the asylum in a state of profound distress, refusing to speak and actively resisting all attempts at interaction. Under the old system, Mitchell would have been physically restrained until her resistance was broken. Conolly's approach was far more subtle. Rather than fighting her withdrawal, he encouraged it, interpreting her silence as evidence of her need for moral guidance and her resistance, as proof of the disordered reasoning that had led to her commitment. Mitchell was assigned to work in the asylum's laundry, a task presented not as unpaid labor, but as therapeutic occupation designed to restore her connection to useful activity. Her compliance was rewarded with small privileges, a slightly better sleeping arrangement, occasional access to books, and permission to tend a small garden plot behind the main building. Over the course of 18 months, Mitchell gradually began to participate more actively in asylum life. She spoke with attendants, followed institutional routines without resistance, and even began to express gratitude for the care she was receiving. Conolly presented her transformation as evidence of moral treatment's effectiveness, a triumph of enlightened management over the crude methods of his predecessors. What Conolly's published accounts failed to mention was that Mitchell's apparent recovery was actually a form of institutional Stockholm syndrome. Her acceptance of asylum life wasn't evidence of improved mental health, but rather the psychological adaptation of someone who had learned that survival depended on complete submission to authority. The person who emerged from Conolly's treatment bore little resemblance to the independent, creative woman who had entered Hanwell, but this personality change was interpreted as successful therapy rather than recognized as systematic psychological destruction. Mitchell's story became the template for Conolly's approach to hundreds of other patients. The goal wasn't to address the underlying causes of psychological distress, or to prepare patients for successful reintegration into society, but rather to transform them into docile, grateful recipients of institutional care who would validate the progressive nature of their treatment through their compliance. The economic realities underlying Conolly's reforms revealed another layer of his system's fundamental dishonesty. The removal of physical restraints wasn't motivated primarily by humanitarian concerns, but by economic efficiency. Mechanical devices required maintenance and replacement, while psychological control methods generated their own revenue through the unpaid labor of patients who worked in asylum workshops, kitchens, and gardens. Hanwell under Conolly became a profitable enterprise disguised as a charitable institution. Patients produced goods that were sold in local markets, worked in asylum kitchens that reduced operational costs, and maintained the buildings and grounds through their unpaid labor. The profits from these activities helped fund the comfortable lifestyle that Conolly enjoyed as Hanwell's resident physician, while the workers themselves received no compensation beyond the supposed privilege of participating in their own therapeutic treatment. The intellectual community's embrace of Conolly's methods revealed the broader Victorian capacity for self-deception in the service of social control. Progressive reformers, medical authorities, and political leaders praised Hanwell as proof that enlightened management could solve social problems without addressing their underlying causes. The asylum became a showcase that visitors toured to admire the triumph of British humanitarian values, while the patients themselves remained as powerless and voiceless as they had been under the old system. Conolly's influence extended far beyond Hanwell, as his methods were adopted by asylums throughout Britain and eventually exported to institutions across Europe and North America. The Conolly system became synonymous with progressive psychiatric care, establishing principles that would dominate asylum management well into the 20th century. But the human cost of this influence was devastating. Thousands of patients who might have recovered under genuinely therapeutic conditions instead found themselves trapped in institutions that had perfected the art of breaking human spirits, while maintaining the appearance of medical respectability. The removal of physical chains had been replaced by psychological ones that were often far more effective at preventing recovery and reintegration into normal society. Conolly's personal downfall began in the 1850s as critics started to examine the long-term outcomes of moral treatment more carefully. Despite years of supposedly successful therapy, very few Hanwell patients ever returned to independent living. Those who were discharged often found themselves readmitted within months, suggesting that the institution had created dependency rather than fostering genuine recovery. More damaging still were the accounts of former patients and asylum workers who began to speak publicly about the realities of life under Conolly's system. Stories emerged of patients who had been psychologically manipulated into accepting diagnoses they didn't deserve, of families who had been convinced to commit relatives for behaviors that would be considered normal variations in human temperament, and of a culture of surveillance and control that had replaced physical brutality with psychological terrorism. The final years of Conolly's career were marked by increasingly desperate attempts to defend his legacy against mounting criticism. His later writings took on a defensive tone, as he struggled to explain why moral treatment hadn't produced the recovery rates his theories had promised. He began to argue that mental illness was more persistent and intractable than he had originally believed, subtly shifting blame from his methods to his patients' supposedly incurable conditions. Conolly died in 1866, his reputation still largely intact among the medical establishment, but increasingly questioned by those who had experienced his methods firsthand. His funeral was attended by luminaries of Victorian medicine and politics who praised his humanitarian innovations, while the former patients whose lives had been destroyed by his reforms remained invisible and voiceless. The tragedy of John Conolly lies not in his intentions, which were undoubtedly sincere, but in his profound inability to recognize that removing the symptoms of institutional cruelty, while preserving its underlying power structures, simply created more sophisticated forms of oppression. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the seductive appeal of reform movements that promise to solve social problems through better management rather than fundamental change. The asylums that implemented Conolly's methods continued to operate for decades after his death, housing thousands of patients who lived and died believing they were receiving the most advanced psychiatric treatment available. The reality was that they had become subjects in a vast experiment in social control, one that had learned to disguise its true nature behind the language of medical progress and humanitarian reform. The legacy of John Conolly reminds us that the most dangerous forms of oppression are often those that present themselves as liberation, that the most effective methods of social control are those that convince their subjects they are being helped rather than harmed. In the sterile corridors of Victorian asylums, where patients learned to be grateful for their confinement, and to interpret their suffering as evidence of their caregiver's wisdom, we can see the perfection of a system that destroyed human dignity, while proudly displaying certificates of humanitarian achievement. The man who had promised to free the mad from their chains had instead forged new ones, invisible but unbreakable, that would bind generations of patients in institutions that had learned to disguise their true nature behind the language of care, treatment, and moral progress. In the end, Conolly's greatest achievement was not the liberation of the mentally ill, but the creation of a system sophisticated enough to convince both its subjects and its observers that oppression was actually freedom, that control was actually care, and that the systematic destruction of human dignity was actually the highest expression of medical science and social reform. The mystery of the vanishing patients. Archaeological secrets beneath Victorian grounds. In the winter of 1992, construction workers breaking ground for a new parking lot behind the former Essex County Asylum made a discovery that would send shockwaves through the archaeological community and force Britain to confront one of its most shameful historical secrets. Beneath 3 feet of carefully maintained Victorian landscaping, they uncovered what appeared to be unmarked graves, hundreds of them stretching in neat rows across an area that historical records claimed had always been ornamental gardens. This discovery opened a door into one of the most disturbing mysteries of Victorian psychiatric care: the systematic disappearance of asylum patients, whose deaths were never properly recorded, whose families were never notified, and whose final resting places were deliberately concealed beneath the manicured respectability of institutional grounds. The Essex discovery was not an isolated incident. Over the following decades, similar unmarked burial grounds would be found at former asylum sites across Britain: Friaran Hospital in North London, Cane Hill in Surrey, West Park Hospital in Surrey, and dozens of others. Each excavation revealed the same pattern: carefully organized graves containing the remains of individuals whose identities had been systematically erased, whose deaths had been bureaucratically minimized, and whose final disposition had been handled with a callousness that shocked even experienced forensic investigators. Dr. Margaret Cleary, the forensic anthropologist who led the initial Essex excavation, described the scene in terms that revealed both the scale of the discovery and its profound implications for understanding Victorian asylum operations. "We weren't just uncovering bodies," she noted in her preliminary report. "We were uncovering evidence of institutional practices that had been deliberately hidden from historical view. These weren't random burials or the result of epidemic disease. These were systematic disposals of human remains that followed clear organizational patterns." The forensic evidence painted a disturbing picture of how Victorian asylums handled patient deaths. The remains showed clear signs of malnutrition, untreated diseases, and in many cases, injuries consistent with physical restraint or violence. More troubling still, the archaeological evidence suggested that many of these individuals had died during their prime adult years, contradicting official records that claimed most asylum deaths resulted from old age or terminal illness. Carbon dating and historical analysis revealed that most of the Essex burials had occurred during the asylum's supposed golden age of reform, the very period when institutions like Essex County were being praised for their humanitarian advances and progressive treatment methods. The timeline corresponded almost exactly with the implementation of moral treatment reforms that were supposed to have improved patient welfare and reduced mortality rates. The mystery deepened when researchers attempted to match the physical remains with historical records. The asylum's meticulously kept admission ledgers showed thousands of patient entries spanning several decades, but discharge records told a different story. While admissions were carefully documented with names, ages, addresses, and detailed descriptions of patients' conditions, discharge information was sparse, often consisting of single-word entries: removed, transferred, or simply discharged. Most disturbing of all, a significant percentage of admitted patients had no discharge record whatsoever. Their names simply disappeared from institutional documentation after their initial admission, as if they had never existed. When researchers cross-referenced these missing discharge records with the number of unmarked graves, the correlation was unmistakable. The asylum had been systematically burying patients whose deaths they had failed to properly document. The investigation revealed that this wasn't bureaucratic incompetence, but a deliberate strategy for managing what asylum administrators privately called the disposal problem. Victorian asylums faced a fundamental contradiction. They were supposed to cure patients and return them to society, but in reality, most patients never left. The institutions had become permanent repositories for society's unwanted and patient deaths created both administrative complications and potential public relations disasters. The solution was elegant in its callousness. Patient deaths were recorded in internal medical logs, but were not reported to civil authorities, family members, or official government statistics. Bodies were buried in unmarked graves on asylum grounds, eliminating the expense of proper funerals while avoiding awkward questions about why so many patients died in institutions that claimed to be providing therapeutic care. The forensic analysis of personal effects found with the remains revealed another layer of this systematic concealment. Patients had been buried with small possessions that told stories their institutional records had refused to preserve: wedding rings engraved with dates and names, lockets containing photographs of children, religious medals inscribed with personal prayers, and letters that had never been delivered to their intended recipients. One particularly poignant discovery was the remains of a woman buried with a bundle of unopened letters addressed to someone named Dearest Mary. The letters, remarkably preserved by soil conditions, revealed a correspondence spanning nearly 2 years from someone who appeared to be her sister, pleading for information about Mary's condition and begging for permission to visit. The asylum's response, found in a separate archive, was a form letter stating that Mary was progressing satisfactorily and that visits were temporarily suspended for therapeutic reasons. Mary had died, according to forensic evidence, within 3 months of her admission, making the asylum's continuing correspondence with her sister a deliberate deception designed to prevent inquiry into her fate. Her sister's final letter, dated nearly 18 months after Mary's actual death, expressed growing concern about the lack of response and threatened to contact local authorities if she didn't receive information soon. The archaeological evidence suggested that Mary's case was far from unique. Many of the unmarked graves contained personal effects that indicated ongoing family connections that asylum administrators had simply chosen to ignore. Wedding rings, family photographs, and personal letters painted a picture of patients who had loving relatives anxiously waiting for news that would never come. Dr. James Whitmore, a historian specializing in Victorian institutional practices, spent several years analyzing the pattern of concealment revealed by the archaeological discoveries. His research uncovered a network of asylum administrators who had developed sophisticated methods for hiding patient mortality rates from government inspectors and public scrutiny. The key to the deception lay in the asylum's classification system. Patients who died were often reclassified posthumously as having been transferred to other institutions or discharged to family care. These false classifications allowed asylums to maintain the statistical illusion that their treatment programs were successful while concealing the true mortality rates that would have exposed the failure of their therapeutic methods. Government inspection reports from the period reveal how effectively this deception operated. Official statistics showed that Essex County Asylum, like many others, maintained discharge rates that suggested most patients eventually returned to normal society. Inspector reports praised the institution's success in treating mental illness and returning productive citizens to their communities. The reality, buried beneath the asylum's gardens, told a completely different story. The forensic investigation also revealed disturbing evidence about the circumstances of patient deaths. Many remains showed signs of what modern pathologists would recognize as evidence of neglect-related mortality, severe malnutrition, untreated infections, and complications from diseases that should have been easily manageable with proper medical care. Perhaps most troubling were the remains that showed evidence of traumatic injuries that had occurred shortly before death. Fractured skulls, broken ribs, and other injuries suggested that some patients had died as a result of violent encounters with asylum staff or other patients. Deaths that had been concealed rather than investigated. The discovery of children's remains among the unmarked graves opened an even darker chapter in the mystery. Victorian asylums routinely admitted children diagnosed with conditions ranging from feeble-mindedness to moral insanity, often based on behaviors that would be considered normal developmental variations today. The forensic evidence suggested that child mortality rates in these institutions were catastrophically high, with many young patients dying within months of admission. One child's grave contained a small wooden toy horse, hand-carved and painted with obvious care, suggesting that even in the dehumanizing environment of the asylum, someone had tried to maintain this young patient's connection to childhood and play. The contrast between this touching artifact and the unmarked grave that contained it epitomized the tragic contradiction at the heart of Victorian asylum care. The mystery of the vanishing patients extended beyond simple concealment of deaths to encompass a broader pattern of institutional amnesia about patient experiences. Research teams discovered that asylum libraries had been systematically purged of patient-created materials, artwork, writings, personal accounts, and other expressions of individual experience that might have contradicted official narratives about institutional life. Dr. Sarah Pemberton, an archivist who specialized in recovering lost patient voices, described the extent of this documentary destruction. We found evidence that asylum administrators had deliberately destroyed thousands of documents that might have provided insight into patient experiences. Letters, diary entries, artwork, and even medical records that contradicted the official narrative of therapeutic success were systematically eliminated from institutional archives. The few patient documents that survived this purge, often discovered in forgotten storage rooms or private collections, painted a picture of asylum life that bore no resemblance to the therapeutic environment described in official reports. Patient letters described systematic abuse, medical neglect, and psychological torment that administrators had worked carefully to conceal from outside inspection. The archaeological discoveries also revealed the cultural practices that had developed around patient death in Victorian asylums. The unmarked graves weren't randomly distributed, but followed specific patterns that suggested ritualized burial practices designed to minimize the human significance of patient mortality. Bodies were buried in simple wooden coffins arranged in precise geometric patterns that emphasized institutional efficiency over individual dignity. No religious ceremonies were conducted, no family members were notified, and no markers were placed to identify the deceased. The message was clear. These individuals had been so completely removed from normal society that even their deaths were considered institutionally insignificant. The investigation uncovered evidence that some asylum staff had profited from patient deaths by appropriating personal belongings and selling them to local dealers. Valuable items like jewelry, watches, and clothing disappeared from patient effects, while families who inquired about retrieving their loved ones' possessions were told that nothing of value had been left behind. This systematic theft represented another layer of the dehumanization process that characterized Victorian asylum operations. Not only were patients denied dignity in life and death, but their final possessions were treated as institutional resources to be exploited for profit. The mystery of the vanishing patients reveals the ultimate horror of Victorian asylum care: the complete erasure of individual human experience in service of institutional convenience and social control. These weren't medical facilities that failed to help their patients. They were elaborate systems for disappearing societies, unwanted members, while maintaining the fiction that they were providing therapeutic care. The archaeological evidence suggests that thousands of individuals entered Victorian asylums and simply vanished, their deaths unrecorded, their graves unmarked, their families left to wonder forever what had happened to their loved ones. The careful concealment of this mortality wasn't accidental. Oversight but deliberate policy designed to protect institutional reputations and prevent public inquiry into practices that would have scandalized even Victorian sensibilities. The ongoing archaeological investigations continue to reveal new aspects of this systematic concealment. Each excavation uncovers more unmarked graves, more evidence of institutional deception, and more proof that Victorian asylum reform was largely a public relations exercise designed to disguise, rather than eliminate, the brutal realities of institutional care. The mystery of the vanishing patients forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how societies choose to remember their past. The carefully maintained gardens that concealed these burial grounds weren't just landscaping features. They were monuments to collective amnesia, beautiful surfaces that concealed ugly truths about how Victorian society treated its most vulnerable members. Today, many of these former asylum sites have been converted into residential developments, shopping centers, and recreational facilities. The unmarked graves have been relocated to proper cemeteries, where the remains finally receive the dignity that was denied them in life and death. But the broader mystery remains. How many other institutions harbored similar secrets, and how many other patients vanished into the bureaucratic void of Victorian social control? The archaeological discoveries have transformed our understanding of Victorian asylum operations from incompetent medical practice to systematic social engineering, designed to remove unwanted individuals from society while maintaining the appearance of humanitarian care. The mystery of the vanishing patients isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a window into how institutions can use the language of help and healing to disguise practices that would be recognized as criminal if conducted by individuals rather than sanctioned by official authority. Behind the gilded gates, the privileged madness of private asylum care. While the horrors of public asylums like Bethlehem and Essex County were hidden behind institutional walls and bureaucratic deception, an entirely different world of psychiatric care existed for those who could afford to purchase their madness with gold rather than endure it in chains. The private asylum system of Victorian Britain created a parallel universe where mental distress was treated not as moral failing, but as fashionable affliction, where patients weren't stripped of identity but rather provided with elaborate new ones, designed to flatter their social status while ensuring their continued profitable confinement. The world of elite psychiatric care reveals, perhaps, the most cynical aspect of Victorian mental health treatment: the recognition that insanity, like everything else in British society, was subject to the rigid hierarchies of class and wealth. The same behaviors that would lead a working-class woman to restraints and forced labor in a public asylum might, in a private establishment, be diagnosed as refined nervous sensitivity, requiring expensive rest cures and individualized attention. Dr. Thomas Bakewell's Springfield's House in Staffordshire, established in 1808 and operating well into the Victorian era, epitomized the luxury asylum experience available to Britain's wealthy elite. Located on a sprawling estate surrounded by carefully manicured parklands, Springfield's resembled a country house hotel more than a medical facility. The building itself was designed by prominent architects who created environments that would appeal to patients accustomed to the finest domestic settings. The admission process at Springfield's bore no resemblance to the dehumanizing ritual experienced by public asylum patients. Wealthy individuals arrived in private carriages, accompanied by personal servants who would remain to attend to their needs throughout their stay. Rather than being stripped of possessions and identity, private patients were encouraged to bring extensive wardrobes, personal furniture, artwork, and even small household pets that might provide comfort during their therapeutic retreat. The rooms at Springfield's were individually appointed private suites, each decorated according to the patient's personal preferences and social status. Titled aristocrats might find their accommodations furnished with family heirlooms and personal portraits, while wealthy merchants were provided with environments that reflected their particular tastes and commercial success. The message was unmistakable. Mental distress among the wealthy was a temporary inconvenience, rather than a permanent condition requiring institutional management. Lady Catherine Ellsworth's experience at Springfield's in 1847 illustrates both the privileges and the particular cruelties of elite psychiatric care. The 42-year-old wife of a prominent textile manufacturer had been committed by her husband, following what family letters described as episodes of inappropriate excitement and unreasonable demands for independence. Her symptoms, which included reading radical political literature, expressing opinions about women's rights, and refusing to participate in fashionable social activities, were diagnosed as intellectual overexertion leading to nervous exhaustion. Lady Ellsworth's treatment regimen at Springfield's was designed to restore her to appropriate feminine passivity while maintaining the appearance of luxurious care. Her daily schedule included elaborate morning toilettes performed by personal servants, leisurely breakfasts served on fine china in her private sitting room, and carefully supervised walks through the estate's gardens. The restriction of her liberty was accomplished through elegant social pressure rather than physical restraint. The genius of private asylum management lay in its ability to make confinement feel like privilege. Lady Ellsworth was told that her residence at Springfields was a necessary retreat from the stresses of modern society, a therapeutic escape that only the most discerning families would recognize as essential for maintaining proper mental health. Her husband visited regularly, bringing news of society and reassurances that her rest cure was proceeding exactly as medical science recommended. But beneath the luxury lay a system of control every bit as rigid as that found in public institutions. Lady Ellsworth's correspondence was carefully monitored. Her reading material was selected by asylum staff, and her social interactions were limited to other patients and approved visitors. She was discouraged from discussing her commitment with anyone outside the institution, and her expressions of desire to return home were interpreted as evidence that her cure remained incomplete. The medical treatments available to private patients reflected the same pseudo-scientific approaches used in public asylums, but packaged in ways that flattered rather than degraded their recipients. Hydrotherapy became therapeutic bathing in elaborate marble-appointed facilities with temperature-controlled pools and individual treatment rooms. Mechanical restraints were replaced by supportive therapy that might involve being confined to specially designed therapeutic furniture presented as the latest advancement in European medical science. The dietary restrictions common in public asylums became specialized nutrition therapy for private patients. Lady Ellsworth's meals were prepared by skilled chefs using the finest ingredients, but her portions and menu choices were controlled just as rigidly as those of public asylum patients. The difference lay in presentation. Rather than being told she was receiving punishment rations for behavioral infractions, she was informed that her carefully controlled diet was designed by leading medical authorities to restore proper nervous system balance. The social dynamics within private asylums created their own particular forms of psychological pressure. Patients were expected to maintain the appearances and behaviors appropriate to their social class, even while confined for mental treatment. This created an atmosphere of competitive normalcy where patients performed sanity for each other, while struggling with the same psychological distress that had led to their commitment. The treatment of children in private asylums revealed another dimension of elite psychiatric care. Young people from wealthy families who displayed behaviors that challenged Victorian expectations of proper childhood development were often confined in luxurious institutions, designed to reshape their personalities while preserving their social status. These educational asylums combined the worst aspects of boarding school discipline with psychiatric intervention, creating environments where children learned to suppress natural development in favor of behaviors that would satisfy their family's social expectations. Lord Pemberton's son Charles, confined at the exclusive Chilgrove House in Sussex from ages 12 to 16, experienced this unique form of privileged depression. Charles had been sent to the institution following complaints from his tutors about his excessive interest in mechanical devices and inappropriate disregard for classical studies. His treatment combined intensive academic instruction designed to redirect his intellectual interests with medical interventions intended to cure his obsessive tendencies. The boy's days were filled with carefully structured activities that left no time for the independent exploration that had characterized his earlier childhood. His interest in building mechanical models was redirected toward more appropriate pursuits like watercolor painting and piano performance. His questions about how things worked were discouraged as evidence of mental agitation that interfered with proper educational development. The psychological impact of elite asylum confinement was complicated by the constant message that patients were receiving privileged care unavailable to less fortunate members of society. This created a form of psychological double-bind where patients were simultaneously told they were mentally ill enough to require institutional treatment and fortunate enough to receive the finest care available. Expressions of dissatisfaction with their treatment were interpreted as evidence of both mental disturbance and ingratitude for their privileged circumstances. The financial arrangements surrounding private asylum care created powerful incentives for extended confinement, regardless of patient welfare. Families paid substantial monthly fees that made long-term patients valuable sources of institutional revenue. The most profitable patients were those who required minimal, actual medical attention while remaining in residence for extended periods, generating steady income without significant treatment costs. Dr. Marcus Fitzhugh, who operated the exclusive Meadowbrook Retreat in Gloucestershire, openly acknowledged the economic realities of private asylum management in his private correspondence with potential investors. The ideal patient, he wrote in 1856, is one whose family possesses substantial means, whose condition requires minimal medical intervention, and whose social circumstances make prolonged residence both medically advisable and socially acceptable. This commercial approach to mental health care meant that recovery became economically counterproductive for asylum operators. Patients who showed rapid improvement threatened institutional profitability, while those who maintained stable but persistent symptoms provided reliable long-term revenue. The incentive structure encouraged treatments that managed symptoms without promoting genuine recovery. The cultural activities available in private asylums served multiple functions beyond simple entertainment. Musical performances, literary discussions, and artistic pursuits were presented as therapeutic interventions, while actually functioning as sophisticated forms of social control. Patients were encouraged to participate in activities that reinforced appropriate class behaviors, while discouraging expressions of independence or critical thinking that might challenge their continued confinement. Lady Margaret Thornfield's experience at Rosewood Manor illustrates how cultural programming served institutional rather than therapeutic purposes. An accomplished pianist before her commitment for artistic temperament and domestic disharmony, she was encouraged to continue her musical pursuits within carefully controlled parameters. She could perform approved classical pieces for other patients and visitors, but was forbidden from composing original music or performing pieces that asylum staff deemed inappropriate for maintaining proper emotional equilibrium. The isolation of private asylum patients from outside society was accomplished through social rather than physical barriers. Patients were told that their conditions required protection from the stresses of normal social interaction, that their sensitivity to environmental pressures made them unsuitable for regular society until their cure was complete. This created a form of gilded cage where luxury masked a complete severing of connections to independent life. The discharge process from private asylums revealed the ultimate cynicism of elite psychiatric care. Patients were rarely considered cured in any meaningful sense, but rather were released when family circumstances made continued confinement impractical, or when their behavior had been sufficiently modified to satisfy social expectations. The goal wasn't mental health, but social compliance, achieved through extended conditioning rather than genuine therapeutic intervention. The letters and diaries that survived from private asylum patients paint a picture of psychological torture disguised as privileged treatment. These individuals understood that they were prisoners, but prisoners whose complaints would be dismissed as evidence of mental disturbance, rather than legitimate grievances about their treatment. Their wealth, rather than providing protection from institutional abuse, had simply purchased a more sophisticated and socially acceptable form of confinement. The staff hierarchy in private asylums reflected and reinforced broader social inequalities while serving institutional control functions. Attending physicians were drawn from the same social classes as their patients, creating relationships that combined medical authority with social familiarity. This made patient resistance more difficult because challenges to treatment could be interpreted as violations of social etiquette as well as medical non-compliance. The visiting policies at private institutions served to maintain family connections, while ensuring continued institutional control. Regular family visits were encouraged as evidence of the asylum's openness and therapeutic value. But these interactions were carefully supervised to prevent discussions that might undermine patient confidence in their treatment or encourage premature discharge requests. Private asylum patients often developed elaborate coping mechanisms that allowed them to maintain some sense of personal autonomy within severely restricted circumstances. They created private worlds of meaning through journal writing, artistic expression, and carefully coded communications with the outside world. These activities provided psychological survival mechanisms, while simultaneously serving as evidence to asylum staff of the ongoing mental conditions that justified continued confinement. The eventual closure of many private asylums in the early 20th century came not from recognition of their harmful practices, but from changing social attitudes about appropriate treatment for mental distress. As psychological theories evolved and new treatment modalities became available, the extended confinement model became less fashionable among wealthy families who sought more modern approaches to addressing family members' mental health needs. The legacy of private Victorian asylums reveals the disturbing capacity of institutional medicine to adapt its abuses to different social and economic contexts. While public asylums broke their patients through crude physical and psychological brutality, private institutions accomplished the same goal through sophisticated manipulation disguised as luxury care. Both systems served the same fundamental purpose: removing problematic individuals from society, while maintaining the appearance of therapeutic intervention. The patients who experienced this privileged form of psychiatric oppression left behind testimonies that revealed the particular cruelty of having one's suffering dismissed as self-indulgent weakness while being charged enormous fees for the privilege of institutional confinement. Their stories remind us that wealth provided no protection from the fundamental dehumanization that characterized Victorian approaches to mental health, but simply allowed that dehumanization to occur in more comfortable settings, the echoes of forgotten voices. As we reach the end of our journey through the shadowed corridors of Victorian asylum life, we're left with more than just historical knowledge. We're left with the weight of thousands of forgotten voices whose stories were buried beneath institutional records, unmarked graves, and the comfortable amnesia of societal progress. Tonight, we've walked alongside patients who entered these institutions as complex human beings with rich inner lives, creative spirits, and deep connections to the world beyond asylum walls. We've witnessed how these individuals were systematically transformed into diagnosis, case studies, and ultimately administrative problems to be managed rather than people to be helped. The true horror of Victorian asylum care wasn't found in any single act of cruelty, but in the methodical precision with which human dignity was stripped away, piece by piece, day after day, until patients themselves began to question their own humanity. These institutions perfected the art of breaking spirits, while maintaining the fiction of providing care, of destroying minds, while claiming to heal them. From the brutal daily realities of public asylum life to the sophisticated psychological manipulation of private institutions. From the well-intentioned reforms that created new forms of oppression to the archaeological evidence of systematic concealment and abuse. The Victorian approach to mental health care reveals a society that viewed psychological suffering as evidence of moral failure, rather than recognizing it as a fundamental aspect of human experience, deserving of compassion and genuine understanding. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the recognition that these institutions operated with the full support of society's most respected authorities: medical professionals, religious leaders, government officials, and social reformers who genuinely believed they were advancing human welfare while participating in systems of unprecedented cruelty. The ease with which torture was rebranded as treatment, confinement as care, and abuse as therapy reveals the dangerous capacity of institutional authority to disguise its true nature behind the language of progress and reform. The patients whose lives we've explored tonight, from the unnamed souls buried in unmarked graves to the privileged prisoners of luxury asylums, share a common legacy. They were silenced by systems that claimed to speak for their welfare while systematically destroying their capacity to speak for themselves. Their stories remind us that the most vulnerable members of any society are those whose voices can be dismissed as symptoms of their own unfitness for participation in normal social discourse. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll spare a thought for those forgotten individuals who spent their final years longing for the simple human dignities we take for granted: the right to privacy, to choose our own daily activities, to maintain connections with loved ones, to be treated as people rather than problems to be solved or contained. Their suffering wasn't meaningless if it teaches us to remain vigilant about how societies treat their most vulnerable members, to question institutional authority that claims to know what's best for people without listening to their actual experiences, and to remember that behind every diagnosis, every case study, every administrative decision, there are real human beings whose lives matter just as much as those of us fortunate enough to remain outside institutional walls. The Victorian asylum system represents one of history's most comprehensive experiments in social control disguised as medical treatment. Understanding its methods, motivations, and consequences provides crucial insight not just into our past, but into the ongoing human capacity for cruelty in the service of order. Control in the name of care, and oppression disguised as help. Thank you for joining me on this difficult but necessary journey into one of history's darkest chapters. Your willingness to confront these uncomfortable truths honors the memory of those whose voices were silenced, and whose stories were almost lost to the convenient amnesia of institutional progress. Sleep well, knowing that your freedom to choose when to close your eyes, where to rest your head, and what thoughts to think as you drift into dreams represents a dignity that thousands of our ancestors were denied, not by accident or oversight, but by deliberate systems designed to erase their humanity in the name of their own supposed welfare. Until we meet again in another corner of history's hidden chambers, may your rest be peaceful and your dreams be free from the echoes of those institutional bells that once summoned the forgotten to another day of systematic suffering disguised as salvation.